So we're joined by Peter Tabuns, the MPP for Toronto Danforth. He's also the NDP's energy critic and environment critic. Peter, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Joel, pleasure. Jesse, a pleasure.
So, Peter, I'm going to turn right away to the nuclear incident or crisis that's going on in Japan. It's been labeled a level 5 incident. The 3 Mile Island incident in the U.S. was a level 5 incident. Chernobyl was a level 7 incident. Some French experts have been arguing that it should be a level 6, but can you put that in context for us, Peter? What does that mean to have a level 5 international incident?
Well, it means that they've lost control of the reactors in this plant, and their risk of losing or loosing upon the environment a large volume of radioactive particles. A level 7 at Chernobyl wasn't just a risk. In fact, there was large-scale contamination with radioactivity. The incident, the accident that's going on in Fukushima is not over yet, although the news in the last 24 hours has been encouraging because it's introduced the idea that things have at least stabilized. Not over, but it may be more stable than we thought a few days ago.
Which is certainly welcome news. Just for our listeners, the difference, I guess, between this incident and what happened at 3 Mile Island or in Chernobyl is in both of those cases, we were dealing with a single reactor malfunction. Here, we're dealing with at least 4 reactors being involved. And while the Japanese authorities and the power plant employees seem to have avoided a meltdown in the sense of a breach of the containment vessel around the nuclear fuel, we know we've had radiation releases from steam. We've also had radiation releases from spent fuel rods that have been exposed. And just what additional complications does it bring into the picture that we're dealing with actually 4 reactors and different problems at all 4, Peter?
Well, every accident that we've had that's been major so far has been different from every other. The fact that you have 4 reactors that are out of control at the same time says that in any one case, you could have a catastrophic event that would make it impossible for anyone to get at the other 3. Even now, on occasion, there have been releases of radioactivity that have been at high enough levels to prevent workers from being close to any of the reactors and have forced pullbacks of the people who've been trying to stop a full-scale meltdown.
Very recently, the news has reported that radiation has been detected in food the food supply in Japan, and in fact, food that may have been exported from Japan. How big a concern is the radiation that we're finding in the food supply, and is this a very time-limited concern, or is this something that's going to be an ongoing concern?
Well, I think it's too early to say. My understanding, unless there's been very different news in the last 12 hours, is that the food contamination that has been identified has come from the area immediately around the nuclear power plant. So to my knowledge, it is not a generalized problem in a large region of Japan, but certainly for the area that's affected, it's a huge concern. And for those who import Japanese foodstuffs, since this crisis isn't over yet, there's always the risk of greater and wider contamination that may well impact on food exported from Japan. How long-lived will that radiation be? I don't think we will know, really, until everything is shut down and proper studies have been done. At this stage, we're dealing with an awful lot of unknowns.
And I appreciate that certainly we are looking at an ongoing crisis with a lot of information that's hard to come by or not fully understood at this point. Turning to Ontario, as Peter, you are the energy critic for the Ontario NDP, I wonder, is there a lesson here for Ontario, or do we simply say that this was the 5th largest earthquake ever recorded? The tsunami was 10 meters high. What happened to this plant in Japan is such a unique and such an extreme event that there really isn't a lesson for us to draw here in Ontario.
Well, first I should say, because this is still ongoing and not over, there are lessons to be learned in the days to come. And frankly, we won't know precisely all that's happened until it is over, things have cooled down, and people are able to do a more detailed assessment. But I think the central issue here, Joel, is that even with the most technologically sophisticated country in the world, a country that has installed their nuclear reactors with safeguards against earthquakes, with full knowledge of the potential for natural disasters that would cause huge problems, it was not able to engineer these plants so that they were earthquake and tsunami proof. The critical thing here is that people are imperfect. We engineer imperfectly, we operate things imperfectly. And just as we can't design a perfect airplane that will never crash or a perfect ship that will never sink, we can't engineer or operate a nuclear power plant or a nuclear power system that will never have accidents. Very roughly, if you look at the 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and now Fukushima events or accidents, every 10 or 15 years, we seem to have a major one. That seems to be statistically the spread. And so I don't think anyone should say we are vastly technologically superior to the Japanese. We've got it figured out. They don't. No, we should recognize that in all human activity, there's margin for error. And when you're dealing with nuclear technology, the cost of that error can be extraordinarily high.
So, Peter, does that mean that you think Ontario should not be moving forward with new nuclear?
Well, I've always felt that it shouldn't move forward with new nuclear, in part because of the risks, but also because of the extraordinarily high cost. One of the things that has happened over the last few decades is that as there have been accidents that have been less public than this one, as there have been accidents that have been very public. Engineers and electrical companies, nuclear operators, have tried to put in more and more safety systems. But as you do that, you drive up the cost of the technology. And the estimated cost of electricity that would come out of the planned new installation for Darlington was calculated at about 20 cents per kilowatt hour, which is about 3 times what people pay for electricity now. I don't know whether the new Darlington plant, as designed, would be accident-proof. I just know that it would be extraordinarily expensive. And given that you can buy wind power at 13.5 cents a kilowatt hour, or you can buy efficiency and conservation measures for under 4 cents a kilowatt hour, why would you build nuclear at 20 cents a kilowatt hour?
Peter, if I might ask, is it, because I mean, we know that one of the major alternatives to nuclear power is coal power, which is an environmentalist, I'm sure you're not, keen on.
I'm not.
Of course, yeah. Do you think that, green energy and green, more environmentally sustainable things like windmills and solar panels, can we realistically have the same amount of power in the long run? Can we transition to that easily, realistically?
I think, in fact, you can run a society on renewable power. And frankly, before the 1960s, the electrical system in Ontario was overwhelmingly renewable. It was hydropower.
Right.
We have the potential in Ontario to install enough efficiency and conservation to put in enough wind turbines, to utilize gas we're burning now to heat buildings, a function that can be used to make electricity at the same time. And frankly, we could buy renewable hydroelectric power from Quebec. I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that we could substantially reduce our reliance on nuclear, eliminate coal, and have a society that was far more sustainable in its energy consumption.
Well, Peter, I'm glad Jesse brought that up. One last question for you, and picking up on an article that was in the Star on the 18th of March. Apparently, the power authorities, the province, paid $161 million to generation companies to not generate power, paid about $146 million to importers of power to not import power. And then in an example of truly gaming the system, some of these generators realized that if they were to continue to operate, they would get about $10,000 in revenue, whereas if they shut down and restarted, sometimes as little as a few minutes later, sometimes up to 2 hours later, they could get up to $50,000 in revenue. That apparently cost Ontario $19 million. I'm wondering, can these sorts of things be fixed or be avoided, or is this just the price we pay for having private electric generation in the province? People are always going to game the system, and we just have to call this the cost of doing business.
Well, I don't think that we have to take those costs. I think that we need to restore public ownership of our electricity system. I think that the profiteering that we've seen going on has to be ended, and if the Liberals aren't willing to do it, the NDP will. You're noting those numbers, but you should also note that within the last 2 months, the Toronto Star reported that, in fact, over the last 5 years, energy traders had made $1 billion energy traders have been subsidized to the tune of $1 billion by ratepayers in Ontario over the last 5 years by buying low-cost power from private companies, private generators in Ontario, selling that abroad and having, outside of Ontario's borders, and having the ratepayers, you and me and everyone who's listening to this show, pay extra so that those private companies got their full contract rate for the power. They didn't just get the lower amount that they were paid for selling on the open market. So there are apparently many hundreds of millions, possibly into the billions, in charges that we are carrying right now for private power that we shouldn't be.
Thank you very much for joining us, Peter, and those certainly are some staggering numbers for our listeners to think about. Thanks for being here.
Joel, Jesse, have a good night. Thank you both.
Thanks for coming on, Peter. Take care.